Well, hello and welcome. My name is Michael Dillon, and I recently became Professor of Politics here at Sayar University, and this is my first event. I know some of the students know me, but this is my first, as it were, public performance for you. And it's with great pleasure that I have organized this symposium on the Fanatic. Let me emphasize symposium, not conference. It's small, it's intimate. I know most of the speakers, and I'm not quite sure what they're going to say, but I know that their work is challenging and interesting, and that they are as concerned as I am that we have an interaction with the audience. So we're quite pleased that it's not a huge audience. This is the only room that's available for us today. It's a big room. It might have been better if we'd had the seminar room, and then the interaction might have been a little easier, but I'm looking around. I see some faces that I know, and I know that they're not shy, and that they are likely to engage in question and answer as well. Let me just explain the structure of the afternoon for you. I think we've already issued the program. It's very simple. I'll take about 10 minutes to introduce the topic, why we chose to hold a symposium on the Fanatic, say some general things about the Fanatic and fanaticism in religion, politics, and in medical science, at least as it arises in those three areas. And then I'll introduce our speakers for the first session. And the afternoon is divided into two sessions. The first session of two speakers who are on the platform now. Then we'll have question and answer. We'll let the speakers give their presentations. They'll take about half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour each. When they've finished their presentations, we'll have maybe up to a quarter of an hour for question and answer. We can be flexible. We are the masters of our own fate. We can take as short or as long as the material interests us and excites us. Then we're going to have a coffee break after the question and answer at the end of session one. come back from the coffee break, and then we'll do session 2, again, with 2 speakers. I'm going to chair the whole afternoon. It's simpler that way, but also I will be writing a lot of notes as the speakers are speaking. And that's because at the end of the second session, I'm going to see if I've got a response to the 4 presentations. Try to pick out some common themes, perhaps, or pick out some critical and important differences. And finally, I also have in mind a couple of points I want to make myself about the whole discourse of the fanatic in politics and theology, in political rationality and theological rationality. Just had a very interesting time out. Oh, I'm projecting my voice, but I can do my... For the record. We're being filmed and recorded. I should have put makeup on. Huh? Okay, thank you, Mazar. So that's the structure. I'm going to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes now. And I'm going to start with the first paragraph that explained why we chose, or I chose, but I know that my colleagues are also interested in the topic, to look at the fanatic and fanaticism today. Fanaticism and the fanatic are powerful, mobilizing devices of national and international politics today. They are of geopolitical, international, and local political, religious, and medical significance. And we're going to cover all 3 terrains today with our speakers. In his recent book on fanaticism, Alberto Toscano observed that there are few terms in our political vocabulary as damning as that of the fanatic. It's a polemical term. Its usage always occurs within polemical, disrupted contexts. It stands, he says, outside the frame. The fanatic stands outside the frame of political rationality, possessed by a violent conviction that brooks no argument and will only rest, if ever, once every rival view or way of life is eradicated. That's the way the fanatic has been presented, and that's what the term is meant to signify and convey in both political and religious rationalities. The classic book on fanaticism and the fanatic was written by a French woman called Dominique Collas. And she notes in this classic study, Civil Society and Fanaticism, she notes that civil society and fanaticism have mutually defined each other ever since the 16th century. So the term is not just an important term of political, religious, and medical concern today in geopolitical, international, and national circumstances, but the term has a long history of usage, particularly going back to the 16th century. I'm going to quote you some Kant in a moment. Before I do, let me just say a little more about Collas's argument, because it's a magisterial overview of the question of the fanatic. Collas details how the term fanatic goes back to classical times, but her magisterial study is most interesting for the way it details and documents how the fanatic arises within different orders of rationality. Theological, within the context of religion; modern political rationality after the 17th, 18th century; and increasingly through the 19th and into the 20th century, how the term fanatic arises within medical discourse, medical science, medical rationality. Second, she details how the fanatic's idiom, what characterizes the fanatic as a political, religious, or medical pathology, arises in different ways. The fanatic expresses him or herself in different ways, depending upon whether the fanatic is religious,
context, a political context, or the medical context. Third, it's clear also that the fanatic is a kind of mad, deranged enthusiast, a curious kind of truth teller. For example, she goes into great detail about the fanatic in the context of the religious wars of the 16th, 17th century. She goes into considerable detail about how, in that context, the fanatic was a prophet, spoke in tongues, prophesied the future, sought to establish the city of God on earth, and disrupted all religious and civil order. So a curious kind of perverted truth-telling in the context of the truth-telling of accepted religious dogma and doctrine. A truth-teller in a perverted kind of way, she says, in the context of political rationalities that were establishing civil society and civil organization from the 17th and 18th century onwards in Western Europe. So the fanatic emerges as a character that poses internally a threat to the very religious, political, conceivably medical order in which the fanatic arises. So within the theological rationality of Christianity, for example, the fanatic arises as the false prophet. And the problem with the fanatic is to be able, for the religious authorities, to differentiate true prophecy from false prophecy. And the fanatic is the false prophet. Conversely, within modern political rationality, the fanatic arises as a kind of false reckoner. Not a prophet, not a false prophet, but an irrational character within the context of political rationality. And then later, as I said, through the 19th and into the 20th century, this modern political rationality characterizing the fanatic not as a false prophet speaking about the city of God, but as an irrational enthusiast working within and against the establishment of regulated civil order. 19th and 20th century, the fanatic becomes a character who's clinicalized, medicalized, arises in the context of a new science, of a new order of rationality. And here, the fanatic then becomes not the false prophet, not the irrational enthusiast, but a pathological figure within the context of medical science. Now, whether or not the fanatic speaks the truth, and the issue is about the truth that's being spoken here, or the irrationality of what's being spoken, whether or not the fanatic speaks the truth, the fanatic certainly has a way also of sometimes exposing truths, often unappealing and unpleasant truths, about the political religious order, possibly even medical order, within which the term fanatic and the character of the fanatic arises. So I want us to think a little bit about how the fanatic, as it were, illuminates as well as exposes the character of the order within which the fanatic arises. Now, one final characteristic aspect of the use of the term fanatic is that it always arises in the context of radical political and religious disorder. The fanatic is someone who is often accused of fomenting religious and political disorder, or one could say that the fanatic is a sign of the breakup and the violent rivalries that occur when religious and political orders come into crisis for one reason or another. So it's in these times of revolution and widespread civil unrest that the term is most often used. And curiously, when one looks carefully, not always in condemning the false prophet, not always in condemning the irrational political animal, not always in dealing with a pathology that arises within medical science's treatment of certain kinds of disorder. Sometimes the term appears in a good light rather than a bad light. And this is where I want to read a little bit of Kant Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, responding to the French Revolution and the excitement that the French Revolution inspired in Kant, and the sympathy it inspired in Kant, despite the fact that, of course, to revolt is in some sense a mad, fanatical act. Kant says, the revolution which we have seen taking place in our own times, and of course the echoes of this will be very evident to you in terms of North Africa and the Middle East today. The revolution which we have seen taking place in our own times in a nation of gifted people, he's talking about the French, but may succeed or it may fail. It may also be filled with misery and atrocities that no right-thinking man would ever decide to make the same experiment again at revolution at such a price, even if he could hope to carry it out successfully. But I maintain that this revolution has aroused in the hearts and desires of all spectators who are not themselves caught up in it a sympathy which borders almost on enthusiasm. At the time, 17th, 18th century and into the 19th century, sometimes the term enthusiasm is a synonym, used as a synonym for the fanatic. So he's actually, in a way, using the term fanatic here. Not themselves caught up in it, a sympathy which borders almost on enthusiasm, although the very utterance of this sympathy is fraught with danger. It cannot therefore have been caused by anything other than, he says, a moral disposition within humankind. Why have I quoted it? Because not all usage of the term fanatic is to condemn the phenomenon. Often, in the context of revolution and the madness of revolution, madness in a kind of literal sense, because the revolutionary is somebody who acts against the prevailing political rationality and the prevailing political order, and acts against it in a kind of mad outburst, that's to say, mad from the perspective of the rationality and the regulation of that political order. And in that sense, is kind of fanatical. So Kant is clearly recognizing there that to act in a revolutionary manner is something that excites sympathy. French revolutionaries did in him, even though the violence and the costs and so on can be unreckonable. Now, I'm going to finish by way of a device to introduce our first two speakers. One of the idioms, one of the ways of speaking, one of the ways of performing fanatically that is not explored in the literature is that of the poetic. Convulsion, speaking in tongues, false prophecies, irrationality, pathology, and so on, all different kinds of idioms of the fanatic. But one that is under-interrogated is that of the poetic. And our first two speakers today, I wish I could say that I planned this, but it was a happy accident of bringing them together. Both of our first session presentations, both of them are about the poetic aspect. In the first instance, Abir Hamdar is going to be our first speaker. He's going to talk about the poetics of jihad. And our second speaker, Julian Reid, is going to talk about the poetics of the fanatic itself in a kind of poetic performance for you. As you know, Plato wanted to expel poets from the polis. And he did so because poets offend against both the logos, rationality of the polis, as well as the logos of the god, theo-logos. So Plato recognized that poets are a nuisance. I don't mean to say that our two speakers are nuisances, but their engagement with the fanatic in relation to the poetics. And in this sense, I think probably I'll leave Abir to present her paper about jihad and the way in which jihad and those who speak about it and practice it have easily been typified as fanatics. The poetic is a very interesting way of disrupting any kind of settled interpretation of the fanatic, okay? So, let me introduce Abir. Abir is, you have a biography of each of our speakers on the back of your program, so I won't go into great detail. Abir is a close friend as well as colleague of mine from the University of Lancaster. Her biography note will just fill in the details for you. The same goes for Julian Reed, who's also a collaborator with me for many years. We've written a book together, and we've written essays together. Julian is from the University of Lapland in Finland. First of all, then, let me introduce Abir Hamdar, and Abir topic, the poetics of jihad.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending this symposium. As Professor Dillon said, the title of my paper is The Poetics of Jihad, and it will mainly deal with the Arabic literary Islamic imaginary and discourses transmitted by key theologians. Thank you. Okay. The Poetics of Jihad. Perhaps no other word strikes more fear in the Western and sometimes Muslim imaginary than jihad. Needless to say, this has become especially true in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks and the subsequent war on terror undertaken by the US and allied forces. While the word jihad evokes images of Gothic religious fanatics and bearded vampires with state-of-the-art weapons who are out to wipe mankind into non-existence, the word takes on broader, richer, and more positive and non-political meanings in Islamic cultures. To be sure, the word jihad, as it is famously understood and translated in the West, is holy war. Yet, jihad derives from the Arabic word juhud, meaning to struggle and to strive. Thus, al-jihad fi sabilillah, a common expression in Arabic, does not translate into holy war for the sake of God, but rather to exhaust oneself in the way of God, to strive to be on the path of God, and to exhaust oneself in finding the divine presence. This struggle and exhaustion, as any Muslim would know, consists of multiple ways of being and living in the world that are not necessarily connected to politics, militancy, and violence. If anything, and as Sayyid Hussein Nasr makes clear, all the pillars of Islam are related to the concept of jihad in one way or another. In this paper, I examine the poetics of those other forms of jihad as they are transmitted and represented in selected Arabic narratives that belong to the genre of Islamic literature and is promoted by key Islamist groups. My paper will specifically analyze works predominantly produced by Arab Shiite Muslim writers and discourses transmitted by Shiite theologians and political Islamic figures in the last few years to argue that their representation and understanding of jihad derives its meaning and dynamic from the story of the Battle of Karbala, which, for all Shiites across the world, is the root metaphor upon which many of their religious beliefs and practices are based. At the same time, this standpoint towards jihad ultimately offers a repoliticization of the term, all the while putting the spotlight on as yet largely overlooked elements of it. While there are numerous references in the Quran to the word jihad, it never solely appears in relation to war. Also, while many Arabic words suggest war, such as harb, war, qital, killing, and ma'raka, battle, the Quran does not employ these in relation to the struggle that Muslims are required to carry out in their life. Rather, the Quran resorts to a vaguer, richer word with a wide range of connotations. In the same way, and as some of you would know, some hadiths of Prophet Muhammad affirm the multiple spiritual and existential meanings embedded in the word jihad. For example, upon returning from a battle, the Prophet famously announced that we return from the little jihad to the greater jihad. And by greater jihad, the Prophet was referring to the internal jihad, or the struggle of the self that the individual undertakes against discordant forces within him, herself, and the effort to achieve higher states of spiritual, social, psychological, and intellectual equilibrium. The wealth of meanings that jihad holds in Islam can also be noted in the fact that a number of Muslim jurists, for example, have categorized jihad into different forms: jihad of the heart self, jihad of the tongue, jihad of the hand, and finally, jihad of the sword, but only when it is employed as a defensive and preventive measure. If anything, many Muslim theologians have explicitly affirmed the latter. The late Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, for example, a prominent Lebanese Shiite theologian, who upon his recent death was portrayed as little more than a terrorist mastermind in the Western media, makes clear that jihad as war is only permitted when Muslims are forced out of their homes and land, their wealth confiscated, and their right to self-determination is stripped away. Fadlallah posits, quote, "As for those suicide bombers who kill innocent people as well as those who accuse others of unbelief just because they differ with them, to those we say that their inhuman and brutal actions have nothing to do with Islam whatsoever, and what they are doing will lead to God's wrath and not his satisfaction." Along a similar vein, Iranian theologian Ayatollah Murtaza Mutahari, one of the leading Iranian theorists on jihad, notes that when Muslims are at war, they should fight with soldiers on the battlefield itself, and even then, only when these soldiers have been declared as transgressors. Mutahari argues that aggression and fighting triggered by the wish to steal people's wealth and human resources is not authorized in Islam. In short, jihad encompasses many meanings and forms, and its correlation solely to holy war is a misunderstanding by both some Muslims and non-Muslims alike. As Bruce B. Lawrence notes, jihad has an impact on contemporary society when its moral mission is highlighted. Lawrence explains, jihad has come to mean the advocacy of social justice in a widening circle that also includes economic participation and prosperity for Muslims in the modern world. For many Shiites, this perspective on jihad carries greater resonance since it is linked to their understanding of the core foundation of the revolution undertaken by their third Imam, Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his subsequent martyrdom. Both acts are perceived by Shiites at large as potent symbols of the struggle to abolish oppression and create social and political justice. Even more, the role of Imam Hussein's sister Zainab in transmitting the details of the Battle of Karbala to the public at large at the time, and in keeping alive the message of Hussein's revolution through intellectual sermons and speeches, remains pertinent today. This has positioned her role within the whole Karbala retelling tradition as one that involved educating the public and confronting injustice and political tyrants with oratory superiority and talent rather than with a sword. Zainab and other female characters in the Karbala story have come to be regarded as ideal models for the highest form of jihad in Islam, speaking the truth in the face of an unjust ruler. In light of the importance that the Battle of Karbala and its outcome holds and continues to hold for Shiites, perhaps it is not surprising that the idea of jihad as a form of intellectual opposition rather than a mere military clash in the face of colonizers and injustice as a whole is a central signifier in literary narratives produced by Arab Shiite writers. This discourse becomes especially present in works published after the 9/11 attacks, and as a result, reveal the ways in which a number of Islamic Shiite writers and key Shiite Islamist figures have challenged the larger negative politicization of the act of jihad, all the while repoliticizing it in ways that subscribe to a more positive and non-violent form of resistance of the practice. Of these writers, Kuwaiti Khawla al-Qazwini's novel, Rajul Taktubuhu al-Shams, A Man Written by the Sun, and Lebanese writer Adnan al-Hajj Ali Bouali, Ali, the father of Ali, stand out. To begin with, in most of her novels, Khawla al-Qazwini places much narrative emphasis on the representation of jihad, both at an individual and collective level. However, the forms of jihad highlighted by her characters offer alternate and as yet overlooked ways of performing and experiencing it, especially in a colonial and post-colonial context. Such forms subscribe to aspects of communication, dissemination of information, the potency of writing and language, as well as an intellectual struggle against forces of invasion and occupation rather than military action. In that sense, al-Qazwini's narratives repoliticize the discourse and representation of jihad. For example, in the novel just mentioned, the poetics of jihad reverberate throughout the narrative. Here, it is one that puts the spotlight on the jihad of women and its importance to society. The novel, which deals, amongst other things, with women's obsession with plastic surgery, the difficulties a divorced woman faces in some Arab societies, and the banning of the veil in France, ultimately highlights the social and intellectual jihad of women and allocates them roles that transcend that of wife and mother. Just as Muslim men have to perform jihad to improve the socio-political standing of their nation and to defend their country against colonial and imperial forces, so do women. For example, Jamila, once Janet, is a European convert to Islam and married to an Arab Muslim woman. Throughout the narrative, Jamila is portrayed as a mujahida because she conducts research and lectures at the Islamic Institute in Paris on issues pertaining to human rights and the true Islamic faith. She also defends French women's rights to wear the head covering, all the while deconstructing the Western negative view about Islam and Muslims. Jamila becomes a voice that creates dialogue between Islam and other faiths and cultures. She herself tells the head of the Islamic Center in Paris, "I try in my research to bring faiths and religions closer together." When she summarizes her research to the audience present at her viva, Jamila repeatedly emphasizes, quote, "the call in Islam to protect the dignity of the Christian and the Jew and to provide them with an honorable life." Jamila's jihad is acknowledged by the Muslim community she now belongs to, both in Paris and the Arab world. One sheikh describes her as a mujahida who strives for the sake of her Muslim fellows, while another tells her, "You are a pride to Muslims." Jamila's attempts to put the spotlight on what she perceives as the true face of Islam cannot be dissociated from the 9/11 attacks. If anything, her mission is all the more important to her because of the impact 9/11 has had on Muslims across the globe. When Jamila's French mother asks her daughter, "What drove you to get involved with these fanatics? They commit acts against humanity. Didn't you see on TV the bombings of the Twin Towers? Their planes, that is Muslim planes, infiltrated the greatest nation in the world. They are more dangerous than nuclear bombs." Jamila defends her new faith and religion and says Muslims who understand their religion properly should not be made to suffer the consequences of what these people did. Similarly, when Jamila's mother complains about her daughter's head covering because it hides the beautiful blonde waves underneath and because it restricts a woman's freedom, Jamila retorts, "Isn't this the same covering that nuns wear?" In all her speeches and conversations on Islam, Jamila is represented as performing acts of jihad that are of the highest standing. Farther away in the Arab world, Fida, a young Arab Muslim woman, is also engaged in performing jihad. Fida, a writer and journalist, has devoted her pen to fighting injustices and promoting truth, especially that which relates to issues connecting Islam to fanaticism, terrorism, and violence. Throughout, the woman is keen on writing newspaper reports and presenting public documents to prove that those who blow themselves up in the hope of reaching heaven have actually been brainwashed by their leaders. These leaders have in turn received massive amounts of money signed, quote, "by the blood of innocent people." Elsewhere, Fida makes clear her opinion regarding acts of violence committed in the name of Islam across the world. Not only does she describe the perpetrators of these acts as possessing heretical thinking that aims to wipe out the other in a barbaric manner, but as people who have abandoned dialogue between civilizations that is based on intellect and a cultural openness. Fida concludes, anyone who wants to apply the Sharia should understand its principles and rules. Fida is aware that she has to challenge the global discourse on terrorism and its assumed correlation to Islam, as well as fight those who proclaim they are Muslims and yet smear the image of Islam. This understanding of her role in society is something that other characters in the novel regard as a valuable jihad, and that she specifically identifies as part of a media jihad. If the narrative of Al-Qazwini's novel clearly takes place in the context of the events of 9/11, the novel Ali Bu Ali by Lebanese Adnan al-Hajj makes no mention of it. Yet, one notes a somewhat similar discourse of jihad as those offered in Al-Qazwini's work, as well as an awareness of the negative connotations attached to jihad in the aftermath of 9/11. Also, while on the surface level, the novel appears to promote militant jihad, a closer reading of it reveals that the use of arms and weapons is subject to a more complicated set of criteria. Excuse me. Set in the south of Lebanon during the Israeli occupation of the country, the novel highlights the struggle between the Islamic resistance group Hezbollah and Israeli forces, as well as with the southern Lebanese army, the SLA, which was serving Israel at the time. Throughout, a detailed description of the planning and execution of operations by resistance fighters to thwart Israeli dominance is highlighted, as well as the heroism and bravery of the fighters. While the narrative of Ali Bouali does not exclude the use of weapons and militancy in the performance of jihad, this remains within the parameters of resisting the forces of occupation and putting a stop to the infiltration of spies to Israel. Here, the acts of violence committed by resistance fighters are, as Muhammad Ayoub would see it, quote, restricted territorially and directed against specific targets that they consider are obstructing their goals of achieving national independence and freeing occupied territory. More importantly, militant action is performed often as a last resort and only when Israeli forces initiate aggression against the community at large. If anything, what one notes is the narrative's insistence on highlighting forms of jihad that do not entail the use of weapons. For example, Sheikh Abir, the town's spiritual and religious authority, repeatedly ends his weekly sermons with a call for peaceful jihad against the Israeli occupation and in defense of a unified Lebanon. Meanwhile, Ali, the main protagonist, who is a school teacher but who works undercover for the resistance to plan operations in the area, also lectures his students on issues of national concern. Throughout, Ali emphasizes the value of what he calls civil jihad. He makes clear that his role as a teacher is that of peaceful educational resistance. After all, and in the words of Ali, a peaceful and literary resistance will protect the dignity of people. Both Sheikh Abir and Ali are keen on informing the public at large about the true meaning and significance of jihad that does not require military action. They ultimately hope that every member of society, from whatever religion or sect, will engage in jihad and in any capacity possible, such as boycotting Israeli products. Throughout, both make clear that their struggle, or rather jihad, in resisting the occupation is for the sake of Christians and Muslims in Lebanon and not simply an act of what has become widely identified as Islamic jihad. Even in moments of extreme desperation and frustration, the characters do their utmost to avoid acts of armed resistance. For example, when the SLA decide to assassinate Sheikh Abir for the effect his sermons have on heightening national solidarity amongst the different religious communities in the town, the Sheikh considers committing a suicide operation at an Israeli checkpoint. His logic is that if the SLA do assassinate him in secret, this will cause civil tension between Christians and Muslims in his town, and all his efforts at national unity will go astray. Thus, why not perform a suicide operation to thwart the enemy's intention? Yet Ali dissuades the Sheikh from such thoughts and asks him to use avoidance tactics to protect himself. It is true, of course, that Sheikh Abir finally blows himself up, but he only does that after the Israeli forces invade his house, arrest him, and lead him to his death. Even then, he waits until they are all in a remote area to avoid hurting innocent people, and then presses the trigger. The narratives of Al-Qazwini and Al-Hajj bring to the forefront alternate categories of jihad, such as civil, media, and intellectual jihad. Interestingly, both reconstruct the ideology of jihad by deploying popular religious idioms and ideal role models from within the Shiite faith tradition. They rely on the trope of Karbala and the symbols and meanings embedded in this historical event, as well as make references to members of the Ahlul Bayt, people of the household, to create counter-narratives that explore the full scope and meaning of jihad. Thus, as aggression against her mounts for converting to Islam, and as she confronts criticism from her closest family, Jamila, in When Men Think, finds solace in reading about the lives and experiences of Shiite imams and the injustices they struggled against. Jamila recognizes the great fortune she had come across in taking them as role models in her struggle to promote a favorable image of Islam. Likewise, when Fida is forced to deal with the attacks on her writing career, she emphasizes that although she has no one to support her, she still refuses to give up. Fida acknowledges that this strength draws its impetus from the stories her mother always told her about Imam Hussein and his heroism during the Battle of Karbala. More important still is the perseverance this character shows when recalling the story of Hussein's sister Zainab and her media jihad following the martyrdom of her brother. Zainab's role in spreading the message of Hussein and in revealing the truth about the injustices he faced armor Fida with the strength required to continue her own present jihad. Clearly, Fida identifies her current writing mission and the struggle to spread the truth within the parameters of jihad that Lady Zainab had established. Along a similar vein, in Ali Bu Ali, the Sheikh, for example, offers sermons on the meaning of jihad in Islam during the 10-day commemoration of the Karbala event, widely known as Ashura. In these sermons, the Sheikh tells stories about the lives of Shiite Imams and highlights the struggle of Imam Ali and Imam Hussein in fighting all forces of injustice. The Sheikh's intention is not to drive people to cry over bygone tragedies, but rather to encourage everyone, and from whatever religion, to resist in their everyday life against the invasion. Throughout, the trope of Karbala becomes the vehicle through which these writers transform the discourse of jihad into a narrative of nonviolent civil, social, and intellectual resistance. This resistance is both against internal socio-political conditions in Arab countries and against colonialism at large. More important is the narrative's ideological resistance of the negative connotations attached to jihad, especially after 9/11, and as transmitted by some in the West and by so-called Muslim figures. The narratives develop alternate meanings to jihad that has its own form, but that still conforms to Islamic principles. In short, the poetics of jihad as represented by these narratives departs from and deconstructs the discourse of jihad propagated in the aftermath of 9/11. This deconstruction mainly manifests itself in a representation of jihad as a positive commitment which believers adopt to improve their socio-political and intellectual standing. Also, the narrative's emphasis on the other functions of jihad reintegrates it into daily Muslim real-life experience. Simultaneously, it offers a negotiation with other cultural values and religious belief systems in a manner that is not anti the other, but open to dialogue with the other. The characters in the two novels highlight that a major element of their jihad is establishing common ground with other religions and cultures, and through that highlighting Islam's emphasis on dialogue. They construct narratives that render Muslim culture and value familiar and accessible rather than alien and different. Also, while the narratives draw on events in Shiite history and the message these events carry to engage in the discourse of jihad, this engagement, as Ira Lapidus in a larger discussion of Islamic revival and modernity would see it, is an expression of modernity. Far from representing a return to a pre-modern past, the narratives mobilize the trope of Karbala as a mode of representing and explaining contemporary political, social, and gendered concerns. Even more, the representational defiance of the negative discourse of jihad is not detached from present-day political and social problems that Muslims everywhere confront today. Ultimately, what these narratives reveal is the way in which the Shiite writers have sought to produce, to use a term dubbed by anthropologist Lara Deeb, an authenticated narrative about Islam, the Karbala event, and jihad in particular. In her ethnographic study of the Shiite community in Beirut, Deeb refers to the break that has taken place among the Shiites between the past then and the current now with regard to religious practice and understandings. This break manifests itself in a self-conscious effort by the community, but especially women, to authenticate the Karbala narrative and Islam at large. And by authentication, Deeb refers to practices and ideas that stem from an understanding of the correct interpretation of Islam. Ultimately, this authentication process seeks to combat Western assumptions about Islam at large, all the while rendering the Karbala event and Islam modern. Finally, if the representation of jihad as transmitted in Arabic Islamic narratives by Shiite writers has been the focus of this paper, one need not look far to find other counter-discourses to militant jihad in the Arab world, and paradoxically perhaps as transmitted by key figures generally understood and identified as fanatics in the West. For example, just last year, and in a speech to mark the first bout of Achievers of the Children of Martyrs, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of the Lebanese Islamic Party Hezbollah, did not call for global or militant jihad against the world at large. Rather, Nasrallah spoke about a superior form of jihad in Islam, the caring for orphans. Nasrallah emphasized that while armed jihad against Israeli occupation in Lebanon and Palestine is important, he noted that it should not cause one to forget perhaps other more superior forms of jihad, such as looking after orphans, be it in the form of inviting them into one's home, stroking their forehead, and supporting them financially, socially, and emotionally. Nasrallah referred to a narrative of Ahlul Bayt which urges believers to attend to the needs of orphans, for in such an act is a key form of jihad. This emphasis on promoting acts of peaceful jihad to mobilize the community and by deploying the trope of Karbala can also be noted on other levels. For example, Shiite theologians in Lebanon and before that Iran have criticized certain aspects of the Ashura commemoration that had been practiced by some, such as the act of flagellation and drawing of blood, describing it as an unacceptable practice seen by the world at large as a sign of fanaticism. Instead, people were encouraged to use this blood for the good of the community through blood donation, one way of practicing jihad. Similarly, and due to the shift that has taken place in gender discourses in Lebanon in relation to the Karbala narrative as a whole, a new development has emerged: the strong desire amongst many Lebanese Shiite women to emulate Zainab and to perform the acts of non-militant jihad that she promoted. This desire of contemporary Shiite women manifests itself in community and social work in the form of volunteering services to Islamic organizations run by Hezbollah and Shiite reformist theologians such as Fadlallah in the suburbs of Beirut. Just as Zainab is depicted as the caretaker of the orphans, children, and wounded at Karbala, many Shiite women, especially those who support and are aligned with Hezbollah, have become engaged in volunteering works to the needy and wounded. Also, a trend that has recently emerged is that which sees young women enrolling in specialized schools to master the proper skills required to become reciters and narrators of the Karbala tragedy during Ashura and otherwise. Some of these women in fact have successful careers in other arenas of life, yet choose to take up this profession during Ashura free of charge as a form of what they consider a jihad of words, similar to the one that Zainab had undertaken. By narrating the story of Karbala and giving sermons afterwards on the significance of this historical event vis-a-vis contemporary life, that they feel that they are also practicing jihad in spreading the message and meaning of Karbala. Consequently, it is no longer strange to find that during private commemorations, particularly, the sermon will shift from the significance of Karbala and Hussein's martyrdom to the local political setting in the country. Even more, during election times in the country, the reciter might especially emphasize the importance of women heading towards voting ballots to make their voices heard and to discard the attitude of quietism that the Shiites of the country had long adopted. In all this, a different form of jihad from the one that the West has focused on comes into play. Thank you.
Thank you, Abir. Let me just draw attention to a note, a line in Abir's biography. Effectively, Abir is a poet and a playwright who's become an academic. It's my pleasure now to introduce Julian Reid, who's an academic, and as you're going to see, on his way to becoming a poet. Julian, the poetics of the fanatic.
Okay, can we lower the lights? Yeah. So how does this work?
It's working. It's working. Just
Okay, so the title of my poem is An Open Letter to Immanuel Kant. It's not easy for me to speak of this world, but I do believe there to be a number of different worlds. You said the world is the system of real relations, and once this system is given, there can no longer be any question of those relations being otherwise. I said, okay, but that there's nothing to prevent me conceiving of another world where relations might be differently arranged. You agreed to that, but said that to speculate and conceive so, I must first acknowledge this world as the only one there can be. Because the possibility of another world is thinkable only within the world I inhabit. The possible suborned to the actual. Okay, I said. Yes, I repeated. The plurality of worlds can only ever be seen from the standpoint of this world and my experience of it. I see always from here. The corollary of the possibility of my conceiving another world is the impossibility of me moving beyond this world, the world, and the imperious necessity of accepting its frontiers as limits. Such is the world in which I appear to myself. I accept those limits as a condition for the appearance I give of and to myself. It's not easy to speak of this world. I can conceive of another world because I accept the necessity of the limits of the world I inhabit. And still, it's not easy for me to speak of this world. I can speak, but not easily, of this world. This world is non-speakable from where I stand. I can imagine another world, different arrangements, but still I cannot speak of this world. It is not of the order of easy. Of it I have nothing to say. But I accept it as the one world, the only one, the truly one. Its frontiers are my limits, all the while being able to say nothing of it. I can speak easily of other worlds because I've come to accept the necessity of this being the one world that is, that which leaves me uneasy. I am a limited being, easy to govern in its limits. Let us discourse on other worlds, all the while accepting the imperious necessity of this one, the true one, of which we cannot speak. Around the dinner table, through the quiet conviviality of our common language, a bond linking you and I was established. Neither one of us felt privileged being there, and neither one of us felt isolated being there. We took it in turns, speaking and listening, present together in the shared sovereignty of speech, connected in the transaction of our exchange. each connected to the other, both sovereign. The value of our discourse in the dialogue between each and the other, emerging, realized. Neither you nor I was drunk. Taking intoxicating drink is a physical means to excite the power of imagination. But intemperance in social drinking leads to befuddlement of the senses, and that is rude behavior. The freedom from care that drunkenness produces is in any case an illusory feeling of increased vital force, you said. Without drink, it was not easy to speak of this world. Speaking of this world requires illusion of the power of speech. We did not speak of this world. We spoke of possible worlds. This world remained beyond and beneath the conversation, while all the time being the imperious necessity without which we could not have spoken. Something surfaces, a world, not this world, the world, but a world. What is serious, you said, is that we know that after the order of this world, there is another. And if the meat we eat tastes foul, it's not because I've been infected by the tastes of a world beyond, but because the meat of this world tastes foul. Once you saw this world, you spoke a truth of this world, as if possessed by the truth. You were bound by the power to tell the truth, a worldly truth teller. But you were never the prophet I mistook you for. The prophet, he interpreted nothing. You interpreted everything. The prophet did not know how to talk. Even though he spoke a lot, I put those words into his mouth, feeding him like the helpless child that he was. No, the truth you spoke was your own. You didn't deal in puissance, it was all about pouvoir. You lived and spoke in the present tense. His delusion, you said, was to anticipate and secure the future, for which you fated him. My delusion was different. I do not deny that I was deluded and silently intoxicated. After drink, I found it easy to speak of this world. I did not speak of possible worlds anymore. I spoke of the world that comes after this one, not possible worlds, the one that is coming at us, the world emerging in and of this world, of which I then found it easy to speak, and for which you denounced me. You said I was lost and needed guidance, that I lacked a guide, an extravagant madman of alienated mind with poor, deluded vision, you said. An element that would orient my experience in its virtual totality is required. One to ally it to life. A spiritual guide we would find for me, you said, nameless, ineffable. Because like every living being, your time cannot be indifferently dispersed and scattered. You have a path to follow and a movement by which to learn how to follow life, while all the while owing your life, its sustenance and survival, to this inaccessible and yet effervescent presence of life. the infinite depths of a finite being, you made me feel upon my spine. You spoke back, as if the borderline of self-control we were guarded against in our temperance had been overstepped. And you said, my truth is a matter of life, lived in attachment to not fear of death, not the truth of life, but the life of truth. The truth which outlives me while inhabiting me, for which you will kill and die. Together we will reproblematize politics and the question of revolution. I will invent a new delirium for you, give you a body without organs, which can no longer tolerate life. Every politics entails its regime of madness. But which madness? Paranoia, highest power of the body without organs. What the body becomes when it can no longer tolerate life. I will cultivate in you an intolerance of life, every living thing, the world itself. No recycling. There are other peoples who have come before me, who are not you. Peoples in whose name I now speak. Paranoid peoples. My peoples. My history is not that of the Skits. My father was called Genghis. He was not a schizophrenic. One day you will convulse in my presence. You will speak in many voices. Those voices will always be my own. I will equip you with my way of truth-telling. I will read signs to you. You will learn how to read signs to me, to read every sign, because every sign means something to me, and to me alone. It always comes back to me. Nothing escapes me. You got the war between the two poles of delirium wrong, the schizo-revolutionary and the paranoiac despot, life instinct and death drive. My work is to reverse those relations. You will learn how to read capitalism and schizophrenia backwards and from underneath, with an eye to its outside, the relation between the state and the paranoiac inversed. For I am the paranoiac. I see everything, from the outside opening the in. I resist the truth of life. I resist the becoming of the world. Only I can stabilize the sign, and I am always the same. I am not the Skits, because the Skits is not a revolutionary figure. After me, there will be no aim of liberating the flows of life. I suffer from an excess of life, a lack of subjectivity. I will rid myself of life. I detest life, and I will care for you so that you might learn how not to care for life, to condemn life with me, to de-skill desire for life. My politics is one of being over becoming. I affirm only the voice which is entirely my own. I live out the intensity which is myself. I am not paranoid. I am paranoia. I have a despot within me. I'm not interested in becoming another. My project is to produce the one. You tried to efface my politics by liberalizing me. You are liberalism. You thrive on a nomadism I do not recognize. You eulogize the creative, mutative, desubjectivizing powers of mere life. They are the sources of your security, not mine. I transcend mere life. I experience the event of truth. I'm given over to the truth of non-life. The sources of my subjection are not to be found in the sovereign power of the state, but the rationalities of life through which state power operates. Biopower. You are biopower. You read to me the history of the skits, the history of struggle as if I were the skits, as if I were a life struggle to outwit sovereignty. You called me multitude. Mine is a minor history. But what is minor history today? My history is that of the state, the despot, paranoia. Yes, my truth is a matter of life and death, not the truth of life, but the life of truth, the truth which outlives me while inhabiting me, for which you will kill and die. Together we will reproblematize politics and the question of revolution. I will invent a new delirium for you, give you a body without organs, which can no longer tolerate life. Paranoia, highest power of the body without organs. What the body becomes when it can no longer tolerate life. I will cultivate in you an intolerance of life and of every living thing, the world itself. There will be no further recycling of the world. Your mistake was to wager so recklessly on the skits, a strategic error. My paranoia is your power. You will discover what a paranoid life can do and what a paranoid body can do. One of you will rewrite the history of the paranoid. You blamed it for all of modern tragedies, the phenomenon of state fascism, of violence done to life by the state, the race, the despotic subject of judgment, the fanatic. You are wrong. Entirely wrong. You depicted the irrationality of a subject which thinks the world is out to get him. My persecution complex, you called it. My strength, my fortitude, the source of the certitude of my being. You called me egotistical because I said I knew everything. I read every sign as if it is meant for me. You called me arrogant. I said you were a hysteric. I responded to the signs. I acted on them. I never recoiled once. I knew my abilities to make things happen. My knowledge, my strength. I was not a rationalist, nor did I have a strategy. I was simply certain, convinced of my own truth, and I was willing to fight and to die for my truth. Now you will work for me. Paranoia works. It mobilizes immobilized agency, where reason would fail and your hysteria wouldn't try. You persecuted me because I have a different relation with truth, a different regime of truth to that of your little skits. But I am spiritual. My relation with truth is direct and unmediated, a truth which speaks through my body. I have an ability to be affected by its truth, and not just by any truth, the truth which I possess, in exclusion of all other regimes of truth. I produce truth. You will perform it. I am directly plugged into the truth. Truth flows from my mouth. Mine is an ecstatic relation with truth. The Spirit nourishes my truth-telling. A creative word makes me happen. I am possessed by self-love. I am a modern sinner. Self-love is pure love, a spiritual experience of the self, productive of ecstasy. My love is my abandonment to the truth of myself. I stripped myself of will in order to receive my truth. Yours is a Christian love. Your love was a Christian obedience. Your obedience is a question of will, of subjection to the will. A humble, mediated experience of love of a mere other. My love is a question of stripping, of being stripped of will to receive myself. I am filled with a joyful refusal, a refusal to tolerate other truths. Intolerance, that's not my vice, it's my highest virtue. I was around in early Christianity before the institutionalization of the church. You diagnosed me as arrogant. I return now to recover the lost history of relations between my insurrection and my paranoia, the great history of my fanaticism. My people who refuse to recognize the legitimacy of your authority. I recall the strength that emerged, my revolt in 1702, 60 of us against 7,000 of you. I knew myself to be invulnerable because I was invulnerable. I had erotic experiences. You called me a vaporous girl. My capacity in comparison with the troops of Louis XIV was awesome. My military exploits were founded in the certitude of my being. I possessed another model of war. Not discipline. Madness was at my very center. It was not my limit. Madness was your limit. I was a Democrat. My paranoia was collective. Everyone was included. Everyone a seer, everyone a traitor. Your betrayal reaffirmed my unity, my oneness. I was confirmed in my paranoia. Intolerance of the truth is my highest virtue. I know only the life of truth, that which lives within me. Intolerance is the highest virtue of my people. I found my inner despot. That was my ethics. I bore the unbearable so that you might be redeemed. You tried to suppress me, but I am still apparent in another world. In 1978, I made a journey to Iran, where I witnessed the power and singularity of the Iranian Revolution. There I encountered a different regime of truth. You tried to suppress it too. You called me a vaporous fanaticism. Your states of revolt are pathetic. The revolution will not be red or black, it will be orange, a burning orange, a great sun. We will all burn in a great sun. Orange is the color of my insanity, the source of my political subjectivity, the source of revolution itself. I am the inventor of my own discipline and clinical practice. Psychopolitics. I have been training for this moment for 18 years. 18 years of preparation. For all this time, I have dreamt of opening my own practice, a clinic where I can practice my own self-invented discipline, psychopolitics. I wanted a confined space, not the desert and not the steppe, but the hospital. A confined space is a productive space. My science requires walls. Science conducted in the name of the human has been aimed at my reduction. Wedded to the truth of the human, it is devoid of truth. I have read many books, books I would like you to read, which I would like you to hear, knowledge I would like you to possess. But that will take time. Your sickness is reason. The cost of that has been my pathology, the political in me. I am my own patient, and you are my sickness. This is a clinic, a place of treatment, but not just that. It's also going to become a barracks, a fortress, a site of war, for war, the war to come. Whither the warrior virtues today, what you call the warrior today is not. I dream of a different army. This place is also a base, a place of expedition, from which I will set out, having cured myself of you, in many directions, with many destinations, many destinies, with many territories to take. You are a kind of tyranny to me. Yours is not the rule of reason, your reason is a tyranny. You repressed my madness, the spiritual dimension of my existence, the source of my war, my little machine. I touch my machine, I want you to touch war. Once I possessed an effective power, a capacity to be affected in extremis. My body was the vehicle of my spiritual power, the mother of my wars. You gave me a name, a fanatic, you said. The place where you said I belonged is where I least belong. All your passions, not my desire. You people around us, you neither see nor hear anymore, and you call your deafness and blindness your reason. It is a non-affected sensible. There are some texts I will read to treat myself over the course of this war, texts which you will bring, and texts which will bring me succor. I will start with Clausewitz. These are a holy grail to me. I will read these books aloud to you to conquer you of me. And I will develop my own aphorisms from them. I will print a book of aphorisms, and you will read them aloud to me. I am not a strategist, and my history has not been told. I will fabulate myself outside of history. It's easy for me to speak of this world. I know there to be a number of different worlds, but I speak of the world that comes after this one, the one that is coming for us, the world for which this world is disposable, of which I now find it easy to speak.
I'm curious what your reactions are to these two papers. I've heard Abir's before. I haven't heard Julian's before. I'm not going to start the discussion or the questioning going, although my head is full of thoughts, questions, irritations, confusions, and sometimes also blank incomprehension. What's being said here to me via these two very different forms of speaking, very different modes of enunciation, deliberately different. Once I saw the titles of the papers, I put these two together, not because I thought that these two papers were going to teach us a single lesson, but for the contrary reason, which I always think of as the basis of learning, because they don't teach one lesson at all, either of them, much less putting the two together. I've said enough. I'm happy now to listen to questions, put the questions, start the discussion. And my advice to you is, please start to ask questions, because if you don't, I'd start to talk much more, because my head is full of questions. So, questions, responses, irritations, matters of fact. Kemal.
I listened to Abir.
It's a big mic. Nice one.
Thank you for these presentations. Just a quick note about these two presentations. First beginning with Julian's poetry. Listening to this poetry as a psychiatrist, I was terribly irritated. Talking about paranoia and psychopolitics. Of course, they are all metaphorical in sense, and there is a book called Psychopolitics by Sedgwick. I just remembered from the memoirs of Ronald David Lang that he once brought a piece of Hegel to his tutor, and how he interpreted this piece by Hegel. And the tutor, the mentor of Lang that time, was a quite organicist, biologist, psychiatrist who was very dependent on the Krapelinin approach and the medical approach to psychiatry. And Lang didn't tell that it was a piece by Hegel. It was written by Hegel. So read the piece twice or three times and said, this is definitely a schizophrenic person. So poetry sometimes goes in the border of madness. It is indeed what comes into my mind again is that when the Prophet of Islam declared his messages, he was called Mejnun. Mejnun is an interesting word because it means that you are possessed by jinns, possessed by some outside creatures, possessed by some alliance, that you cannot utter such a word. You must have already been possessed by some alliance or some outside forces to utter so powerful words. So poets are always on the border of paranoia and mental problems, and Julian was quite brave indeed to walk on that line. Thanks very much. And for Abir, it was also very intellectually stimulating for me, because we are here subject to so many corruptions in the language of social sciences. I mean, I remember a book called Macworld versus Jihad by a very eminent social scientist. So jihad is a very polluted word in the minds of the Western intellectuals. And this has to do, I think, with the power of science prevalent in the East, in the West, sorry. What I want to mean is that Paul Feyerabend once wrote a preface to his book Against Method in Turkish. When it was printed in Turkish, he wrote a preface, and he said that because we in the West have the financial power and we in the West have the military power, our science is much more valuable than yours. So we don't have the power to counterbalance this situation. I mean, you cannot talk about a Christian, let's say Christian or a Jewish very holy phenomenon in a pejorative manner. And this is not fair, of course. But many academics in the Western world can use some terms in a very polluted manner, in a very misintended manner. So I think a discursive strategy, a critical strategy should be applied to any kind of such efforts, and there should be a science dealing with that, I assume. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with Julian Reld. In fact, I don't think it was a poetry. I believe it was a philosophy. I'm a 43 years old, not my age, as student of philosophy. And I wouldn't say I had a hardship to follow him, but it was fascinating. I'm very much doubting that this youth should not take it as a kind of, you know, harsh critic or harsh warning. I'm really wondering, and I will definitely encourage this youth, our students, that they should raise questions to him, in which case I will understand with great pleasure that they have really understood the message of the Julian Reld. I didn't have much difficulty. As I said, 43 years of study did teach me something. It was not poetry, it is over poetry. It was or we could call it perhaps philosophical poetry. Only poetry is insufficient to really appreciate the quality of that presentation. I'm very grateful. For Abir Hamdar, I have a very single and simple question. Could you make a very brief comparison under the general conceptual part of the jihad with that of crusader in the theological base? Very banal. I'm not going to have a deeper kind of discussion in theological terms. But can you make it in comparison? Because it's representing basically two monotheist religion. And is there any resemblances? Is there any differences? If it is the case, what are they? Crusaders.
With the Crusaders. Yeah. That's a very interesting question, and I mean, to be honest, I don't, because my background is not theology, my background is literature, so I feel like you actually have more to say about this than I do, and I can speak about the literary works themselves and how they represent different forms of jihad, but in terms of a theological, historical perspective, that's where I think I'm not sure I'm capable to give an answer, actually. So if you would like to give us one, then please. No. I just feel that I am not. I mean, I'm now curious myself.
As a compliment to your presentation, I would say that I don't really envisage. Don't take it wrong, sir. But it is Christianity anyway. Oh. And that started from their country.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Origin of the Crusaders. I don't think they have the same kind of poetry in their actions.
No, I mean, I can speak about specifically, because I'm speaking within the context of Shiite political thought and Islamic narratives. For example, historically, poetry was used as a very strong mode of resisting oppression. And in the earlier Shiite poetry, historically, key figures encouraged the public to write poetry as a way of dealing with the many hardships that they were facing. So in Arabic literature and specifically, expressions of poetry emerged out of political context in a way, as opposed to a literary expression and experience. I don't know if this has answered.
So did I understand. Did I understand. Anyway, I would encourage you to make
yes,
a force.
now I want
to make a force in the future, and if you meet again, you can teach me something.
No, you. Thank you very much for drawing my attention to this. Thank you.
Just a brief note that a United States former leader can declare a crusade against the rest of the world, but no Muslim leader can declare a jihad against the rest of the world. That's a major difference, I think, about the usage of the terms.
You had mentioned the lack of a pejorative word in reference to Christianity and Judaism that has a sort of similarity with jihad in Islam. And this crusade is exactly that. And despite, I'm assuming you're talking about Bush going on a crusade, although Bush, and there may be others who view this as a positive thing, the word crusade brings a lot of negative connotations, as opposed to a word like mission, which is, you know, we're going on a mission to learn something, to find something, to do something. The word crusade has this negative connotation, as in it's a mission with an intent that's been misguided in somehow. So it's an intent to learn or an intent to do, but to do with, sorry, brain fart here. But there's some fundamental part of this mission that's been corrupted, that's been missing. So crusade is definitely a word aligned with Christianity that has this purgative use.
I'm just wondering if Julian wants to come back.
I mean, to say that you're absolutely, I mean, I do struggle with the question of how to conceptualize this text. Is it a poem or is it something else? The text originated from a choreographic performance that I took part in Stockholm a couple of months ago. And so it was a text overlaying a dance performance. So it definitely didn't emerge as a poem as such. But then working on it again for this occasion, I had to rethink, what is it? What is the text once it's taken out of that choreographic setting, how to conceptualize it? And I did start to think about it as a poem, but I'm still uneasy with that, given the, as you say, the philosophical nature of the material as well as other issues. But in response to Kemal, I really wanted to hear more. I mean, unfortunately, we're not in a seminar setting, but I think some of the points you raised are absolutely crucial for our discussion and abilities to explore this problematic. You mentioned your irritation at the use of the concept of paranoia and so forth. And I think this is an absolutely fundamental, question. The fanatic, for we moderns, is fundamentally a mad kind of subject, right? It's a subject diagnosed for its madness, either paranoid or schizoid or whatever other form of delirium it is that has been labeled on the fanatic. So this question of the status of the relation, or the nature of the relationship between madness and politics is, I think, absolutely fundamental for the ways in which we go about answering the question of the nature of the fanatic itself and understanding what we're looking at when we're looking at the phenomenon of the discourse of fanaticism, and of course the real world of subjects who end up being labeled fanatics and having to swim within this very negatively connotated discourse of fanaticism. You know, when we read back through the history of political struggles, especially in the modern era, what we see is this continuous reaffirmation of a strategy, discursive strategy, designed to label the political subject a mad subject, a delirious subject, either paranoid or schizoid or suffering from some other form of delirium. This is a consistent feature of the ways in which states and regimes of power have responded to political subjectivity and insurrections and emergent revolutions. Indeed, if we go back to the early 18th century, the very last religious war that occurred in Europe, that was the insurrection of the Camisards in the Languedoc region of France. And this is an insurrection which Dominique Colas, in the book which Mick mentioned earlier, goes into looking at in some depth in her book on fanaticism. We find precisely this psychiatric medical discourse emerging. The Camisards were labeled mad, paranoid, deluded, so on and so forth. And yet, you know, the things that were being labeled mad and deluded in them were in actuality the very source of their political subjectivity, the very source of their capacities to struggle and to, indeed, wage incredible campaigns of violence. These were men and women, but children too, teenagers, boys and girls, a kind of multitude, you know, a fundamentally a real existing multitude with no common identity, no particular leadership, but nevertheless with an immense capacity to fight and destroy the sources of its persecution. 600 Camisards against 6,000 troops of Louis XIV. 600 men, women, children, teenagers, girls and boys that put to rout 6,000 of Louis XIV's troops on account of their supposedly paranoid belief in the actuality of their persecution, as well as absolute certitude in their right and the necessity to rebel, and also of their capacity to win. This was a people that believed beyond all reason that it was going to win, that it had to win. And there are relations between the supposedly paranoid nature of their relation with truth, the way in which they thought about and sought to protect their truth, and the ways in which these people fought. The certitude with which they went to war and destroyed those troops of Louis XIV. So I just want to highlight this problematic of the relationship between madness and the political, and pose the question of what precisely it is that we're talking about when we talk about madness, when we operate within this clinical discourse of paranoia and schizophrenia and so forth. What is it that we're talking about? Is it a lack? Is it a pathology? Is it a weakness? Is it an absence of reason? Or is it actually the source of everything that we think about as being the source of the political in human beings, the capacity for struggle and the capacity to fight and survive and win?
Kemal's paper is the next paper. It almost sounds like a queue to bring you on the stage, but the coffee is waiting, and we've gone 10 minutes, 15 minutes over time. We're due to restart at 5 o'clock. Can people bring coffee into this room? Musafa, is it possible? So, 15 minutes. Yeah, I don't want to lose the audience or the beginning of the growth of a discussion here. So my suggestion is let's go get coffee, take 5 minutes, 10 minutes to get the coffee, and then come back in. Otherwise, I think we might lose this kind of burgeoning discussion, and also the wonderful bridge that Julian, in his questions back to Kemal, has made a lovely bridge to move into the second session. Okay. So back in here at 5. Back here at 5. Okay. That work? It's 15 minutes. It's not a problem. Okay. So then it definitely is up to me. because I've given myself some time.
I will say that 6:20 they will be ready.
Yeah.
It will be earlier or later.
I'd say 6:30. 6:30 is fine. Yeah, yeah, and I will definitely then finish because it's in my hands. Okay. How are you doing?
Not bad.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you for coming back. It's late on in the day, and we have 2 more papers to do. It's second session. I just moved straight in. Julian gave me the bridge to Kemal. Kemal, who's our next speaker. Again, is a biographical note on Kemal, and I'm quite excited by having a practicing psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry now to speak about the mindset of the fanatic. Kemal, it's over to you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mick. Thanks for your kind invitation. I'm going to talk about the fanatic mindset, but with particular relevance to Middle East and the rising violence in the Middle East. So I will sometimes use the terms fundamentalism, fanaticism interchangeably, though this should not be the case. And I will try to differentiate between these two in the beginning of my paper, and then I will talk about religious fundamentalism as a form of ideological fanaticism. And of course, as I will discuss now in my paper, not all fundamentalisms are bad indeed. There might be very passive fundamentalisms. There might be some fundamentalisms who are only showing themselves in political action. So bearing this in mind, I will mostly talk about the religious fanaticism or the ideological fanaticisms which mostly end in terror in the Middle East. So I will try to understand, I will try to bring the psychological explanations to that mindset. I am not sure, I must say in the beginning, whether these explanations work or not. Because when we are trying to bring a psychological explanation to a behavior, we are reducing the behavior. We are isolating it from the context that it is born. So when you talk about a suicide terrorist in Palestine, and if you talk about the traumas of his past, of the traumas that he lived in his childhood, and if you draw a causal link between the traumas that he experienced in his childhood and the suicidal act he has committed, it is a very plain reduction. So you are ignoring the context of humiliation, you are ignoring the political distress the people are witnessing, living, and we should bear in mind that causal chains, causal psychological chains, deterministic chains are not always working in today's quite complicated world. Fanaticism establishes a false sense of security in an otherwise totally insecure world. Though fanaticism and fundamentalism are different concepts, they seem to convey similar meanings in the contemporary era. Extremism, dogmatism, exclusivity, self-righteousness are common denominators. Religious extremism and fanaticism have occurred throughout history and in every religion. Recent years have witnessed an increasing tendency to give a pejorative meaning to fundamentalism. As discussed by Julian, there can be good and bad fundamentalisms, and sometimes the secularist fear and hatred towards anything pertaining to religion may amount to a similar oppressive condition called anti-fundamentalism. I am going to focus my discussion on religious fanaticism, which might be regarded as the most extreme form of religious fundamentalism. So I am not dealing with a fundamentalism which might be described as an anti-modernist religious movement, but rather an obsessive wish to control and order the world at the expense of ruining lives. I will also try to ponder on the fanatic mindset which might end in terrorism. I should begin by addressing the hijacking of the word terrorism. It has been said that one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. Many analysts of terrorism today study the discursive struggles around the very term itself. The fact that the powerful is able to define what terrorism is, who a terrorist is, and how we, in quotation, how we should fight against terrorists, make it even more urgent to understand the political and moral connotations of and the struggles around the term. Terrorism may be described as the institutional violence of the fundamentalist. To my mind, associating the word terrorism with the non-Western world may indeed conceal the state-sponsored terrorism of the United States or Israel. Bearing this in mind, this paper will mostly focus on the dynamics of ideological fanaticism and how this might be fueling the rise of violence in our geography. I will try to delineate the psychological foundations of ideological fanaticism and will try to discuss whether psychological explanations might bear any significance. Eric Hoffer, in his book, The True Believer, writes that individuals who have faced disappointment and lack fulfillment find it easy to sacrifice their lives in search of meaning and significance in life. These individuals attempt to escape their own selves through fanatical views that allow their identities to be absorbed in a group identity. The appeal of mass movements comes not from the doctrine or principles, but the fact that they promise an escape from the hidden anxiety, loneliness, and meaninglessness within human existence. In organizations which view destruction and terror as a legitimate tool, the hatred of the marginalized is used to create group loyalty. Hatred towards the oppressors serves as a glue, which holds together and gives the illusion of power to individuals who see themselves to be powerless, downtrodden, and oppressed. With this feeling, the sense of oppression is converted into power and legitimacy. He is now a chosen one, and whoever does not stand on his side is the damned. I have expressed the fact that organizations that use hatred as a political tool benefit from denial and projection as defense mechanisms, projecting the things that they don't like about themselves onto their enemies in order to turn their enemies into objects of hatred. They define those enemies as strangers, barbarians, or infidels. As you will recall from the recent past, those who oppose us are axis of evil, or the enemies of our lifestyle, in quotation. The psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion defines paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions as the two fundamental stances in the psychic lives of individuals. In the paranoid schizoid position, we indulge in extreme splits between love and hate, good and evil, us and them, and treat others not as full humans, but as part objects, and indulge in hostile accusation and attribute guilt in a brittle, punitive way. When people are frightened by the threat of terrorism as well as the government's exploitative use of it, the denial of vulnerability alternates with overwhelming feelings of impotence. The inability to tolerate ambiguity produces a bifurcated view of the world as good and bad, with a tendency to identify with an all-powerful goodness, while all that is bad is projected onto a demonized other who becomes the target for aggressive attacks. Just remember what happened after the September attacks in the United States. This was the psychological mechanism that was operant in all throughout the United States, and how to me, a very arbitrary target was chosen to make people feel stronger, to make the ordinary person feel stronger. This split constitutes a manic defense that protects against the anxiety of helplessness. This is the same in Turkey. I mean, when there is a trauma in the eastern part of Turkey, the Turkish jets go and bomb the mountains. Does it work? We are not sure, but it makes people feel better. The more frightened and angry we are, the more difficult it becomes to separate the authority of the government and its discourse, especially when they promise safety in a dangerous world. Life's experiences activate primitive reactions, leading us to rationalize and project our unconscious fantasies onto the world in the hope of assuaging them and getting control over the things that threaten us. Karen Armstrong has written in depth about fundamentalism. Now I quote her. Fundamentalists do not regard their battle as a conventional political struggle, but experience it as a cosmic war between the forces of good and evil. They fear annihilation, and they try to fortify their beleaguered identity by means of a selective retrieval of certain doctrines and practices of the past. To avoid contamination, they often withdraw from mainstream society to create a counterculture. Yet fundamentalists are not impractical dreamers. They have absorbed the pragmatic rationalism of modernity, and under the guidance of their charismatic leaders, they refine these fundamentals so as to create an ideology that provides the faithful with a plan of action. Eventually, they fight back and attempt to re-sacralize in an increasingly skeptical world. We human beings tend to regress under stress. That means we turn to our childhood. We react with our childhood norms. We react with our childhood defenses. We become infantilized. We cannot bear uncertainty. We divide the world into safe and dangerous, good and evil, life and death. To be a fundamentalist is to see the world through these lenses, in stark dichotomies, and to derive a sense of belonging and security from sacred texts of charismatic leaders. Satan mirrors our own confrontations with otherness. By characterizing the so-called enemies of the United States as satanic or evil, as Mr. Bush routinely did, we can justify hatred, even mass laughter. The hegemonic leader gathers all the best human qualities in himself while placing others in a subhuman category. The inferiority and the inhumanity of the other creates the identity of superior us. The narcissism and the superiority of the aggressor forms one side of the act of violence. Dehumanization and stigmatization of the victim forms the other. Every act of violence follows or is followed by a period of paranoia. The method of projection, whereby the individual says, I am not the wrong one, he is the wrong one, helps vindicate the act of violence and reduce the feeling of guilt. According to the oppressor, the victim is a threat to his existence. The act of destruction is rationalized because of the claim that it neutralizes the threat, fixes its faults, and therefore brings justice. In reality, the enemy is often just a partial reflection of the individual's own identity, of which he is ashamed and in denial of. So we create the barbarians, we create the infidels. When we look at the violence that appears to be turning the Middle East into a bloodbath, we can see Frantz Fanon's vision that violence will only yield when confronted with greater violence. Frantz Fanon was saying that violence is curative, it's therapeutic. So if you want to cure, if you want to make the condition better, you have to produce more violence. People whose lands have been occupied and whose voice has been silenced think that they can only escape the violence surrounding them by responding to it with even greater violence. Violence provides them with an illusion of power. It provides status, meaning, and identity in a world which no longer recognizes them. It is a well-known psychological process for the oppressed to emulate the oppressor. For as long as the psychology of persecution and oppression exists among masses, anger turns to hate, hate to violence, and violence to terror. Invaders who attempt to rule the world with terror are faced with followers who believe that in emulating them, they can gain a voice. In the unchanging logic of the marginalized, true believers think that they can bring justice to the world by destroying everything, everyone, and everyone that doesn't belong with them. The last link in the chain is also the first. The fanatical beliefs that begin with the thought, you are either with us or against us, trap individuals to the dark corridors of terrorism. The bloody violence in the Middle East is the fruit of the seeds of hatred already planted in the world. We don't know where these seeds may flower elsewhere. The only response to the true believer who appropriates the truth and claims sole possession of it could be to emphasize the sanctity and the uniqueness of the human life. Terror affects us by spreading the fear that this world is not a safe place and it is impossible to trust people. Psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan thought that the identity of religious extremists involved the regressive use of religious beliefs and feelings. This collective regression includes an absolute belief that one is true believer, the only one in possession of the only true divine text or rule, needing a supreme leader as the sole interpreter of the divine text, the exhibition of magical beliefs, a pessimistic attitude to the world, with paradoxically coexisting feelings of victimization, helplessness, and omnipotence. The construction of psychological barricades between the group and the rest of the world, expectation of threat and danger from people and things outside the group's borders. Now I would like to focus my discussion about the mental foundations of terror. Ideology, according to Cemil Meriç, the Turkish thinker, is a straitjacket on perception. And it is a complete belief system providing an explanation on the nature of existence according to, as I said, a more formal definition. This belief system imposes a raison d'être, an ideal to be reached, and means for achieving these ideals. For paranoid ideologies, the world is divided into two strict categories. There are the good, those who follow the ideology, and the bad, those who oppose and threaten the ideology. Be it in the corridors of Pentagon or Washington, or be it in the mountains of Tora Bora, it's the same. It's the same logic. Either you are with us or against us. According to this view, if the enemies of the ideology are not eliminated, they can eliminate the true believers at any moment. Paranoid ideologies invite their followers to sacrifice themselves. By being included in the circle, the individual must surrender his interests, rights, reason, and conscience. Through unconditional resignation to the leader, the individual is absolved of the moral responsibility of his actions. Terrorism is the violence by individuals or groups who have gathered around a paranoid ideology with self-righteousness, dogmatism, and extremism, exclusivity, and secrecy towards other individuals and groups. Hatred and ruthlessness is legitimized and rationalized through paranoid ideology. The hatred brewing inside the group members finds an escape through a determination to extinguish all groups, institutions, and forces that they find perverse and faithless. For individuals who are withdrawn from their families and prone to allowing their own identities to be dissolved in a group identity, honest religious feelings can turn into concrete ideological judgments. This concreteness, this belief in the unquestionable, gives the group a feeling of exclusivity and might. There are signs in the sacred texts, according to them, that allude to them having been chosen, and only their leaders can truly understand and interpret these texts. If you speak in the language of psychoanalysis, to devote yourself entirely to a chosen group symbolizes the individual meeting and becoming with an idealized parental figure. The individual thinks, I belong before I am. On the one hand, there is a victim mentality, and on the other, a feeling of power from being a part of a chosen sect. On the one hand, there is an other who threatens his existence and is waiting to exterminate him, and on the other, a feeling of certainty in being able to teach anyone a lesson or give them what they deserve. Research into individual characteristics of terror participants has often, though not always, focused on a traumatic event, abandonment at a young age, or an inferiority complex. When victimization turns into aggression, the individual has to avenge his powerlessness and muteness. This is the only way he is able to realize himself and avenge the deprivation of his childhood. Ideology is only a tool. Since anger and revenge are difficult to confront, ideology packages them and makes them rational. As I said in the beginning, I mean, these explanations are not always correct. So the researchers are trying to find some causal factors, and mostly they come close to trauma theory, and they are trying to make an explanation out of the trauma theory, but this does not explain all of the suicide terrorism cases, for example. Our actions and approaches in later stages of life are shaped in the twilight zone of childhood. A child seeks safety and security from the moment it comes into the world. He grows up yearning for a comforting mother. But in reality, the world outside has set traps for him and trips him when the time comes. From the fact that a baby cries when it sees a strange face, to the warnings from parents regarding strangers when a child is growing up, a child is aware that he must be suspicious of those who are strangers. The desire to be close or to belong, to receive approval from those close to us, causes a fear and anxiety of those who are different. Psychoanalysis symbolizes the forced separation of a child from a parent as Adam's fall from heaven in the mythology of Abrahamic religions. If the separation from parents is problematic and traumatic, the child can be thrown to an extreme mental state. A traumatic separation leaves him with deep emotional scars that can only be healed by embracing a political body instead of a mother's body. But what if the political body is itself scarred? What if it makes the child feel persecuted and victimized all over again? This is the turning point where the desire to kill and to die begins to surface. I'm quoting Robert Young here. The baby whose needs are not met blames the mother carer who has not provided or who has removed what one needs and is experienced as abandoning and withholding. One feels attacked, as it were, by lack, hunger, and one wants to retaliate. It is so tempting to defend oneself from feeling so abject by becoming in fantasy the opposite and attain a position of complete self-sufficiency and certainty. I am nobody and am sure of nothing becomes I am powerful and sure about everything. It is in the book. If fundamentalists were really sure, they would not have to be so intolerant. They lose the inability to imagine the ability to imagine the inner world and the humanity of the others. Sympathy, compassion, and concern for the other object evaporates, and brittle feelings of blaming and destructiveness predominate. Do I have some time more? There is a story. There's a popular Turkish story. I mean, the symphony orchestrate of the presidency has visited a village in Anatolia, and they performed classical music and in Sivas. So one of the villagers after the concert is asked the opinion by the reporters, that time radio reporters or newspaper reporters, and he says that, what did you think about the classical music? The question is this, and he says that, you know, man, Sivas has not seen such a torture since it has been Sivas. So I hope that it's not becoming a torture for you in this time of the day. Okay, so murder and suicide are twins. Both are an attempt to have a control over death. The individual who kills himself to leave behind a bloodbath is turning life into the target of his anger and despair, avenging life for what it has denied him. On the other hand, the feeling of being chosen leads him to believe that there is a better life for him in the next world, that in becoming a martyr, his soul has been immortalized. When individuals become involved in violent groups, it is not because they are following the footsteps of ideology. Often they are brought together through a shared journey. This friendship brings them together, and then ideology becomes the touchstone through which their loyalty can be tested. Ideology is where the group is tested on how dedicated they are to the mission for which they were chosen. Through their, some leaders, through their malign narcissism, which is very pathological, very extreme forms of narcissism, they turn religion into the opium of the oppressed. These paranoid, antisocial, and narcissistic leaders choose their followers among the victimized, downtrodden individuals who are capable of submitting to a group psychology. Violence only becomes destructive when it finds the right personalities and right social foundations. The existence of a mission, quoting, mission, gives the hopeless a chance to take control of his or her own fate and experience the feeling of victory. The ultimate sacrifice of life is an additional moral victory which expresses the depth of devotion to the mission and brings meaning through death to a life that has already become meaningless. But how is it that these people who walk among us one day turn into murderers overnight? Freud suggested a century ago that the impulse to kill exists in every person, although to different degrees. We do not easily resort to our primal violent instincts, limiting their expression with social norms. But sometimes groups regress, they become childish, and abandon maturity for primal instincts. The individual who would not go near violence in his independent existence may become aggressive as a result of group mentality. In particular, groups who are closed off to the outside world, who draw their strength from the loyalty and submission of their members, can easily regress to violence and aggression. Some societal traumas can also draw hopeless, poverty-stricken, lonely, and desperate individuals to terror. The systematic state terror that exists in the Middle East with the help of the colonial powers provides opportunity for these sorts of groups to create an ideology of victimization. In the picture that they paint, the other plays the bad guy who brings the world onto the brink of polarization. As a result, the historical trauma of the Islamic civilization's defeat at the hands of the West is relieved, and the old wounds are reopened. Colonial expansion that reopens these wounds then pushes those groups within the Islamic world who harbor elements of violence and who have become organized around an ideology of victimization towards primal aggression. These, quoting again, holy warriors are able to multiply out of the sense of injustice, national humiliation, and the feeling of having been crushed by global powers. I am almost done, so I'm finally will talk about the so-called relationship or so much uttered relationship between Islam and terror. We know that individuals who have experienced disappointment and who feel their lives have been wasted can easily sway to extremes. An individual who is happy with his life and feels that he has realized himself perceives the world to be basically good and wishes to preserve what he has been given. An individual whose path has been intercepted with ordeals seeks refuge in the hope of the changing of the world in a radical manner. Many fundamentalist movements provide a portrait of the world that is broken and in ruins. While the present is diminished, the past is glorified, and the image of a while the present is diminished, the past is glorified, and the image of a future that will reclaim past glory is created. The true believer who attempts to change the world to cure the despair of being who he is diminishes life in diminishing the present, so that there is nothing to lose in dying, and the hope of victory seems preferable to this worthless existence. This is an issue that is discussed in the book of Fethi Ben Slama, who is a Tunisian psychoanalyst and who has written a very interesting book about the psychoanalysis of Islam. It has also been translated into Turkish. And Ben Slama says that the major trauma or the major stress of the Islamic world is the hopelessness of being he himself. Doesn't want to be himself, wants to be something other, but he cannot get rid of being himself. So he is trapped into his identity, and he's always in struggle with his own identity. Having lost the real identity of the society in which he lives, and he determines the present as an enemy and wages war. His own existence will gain meaning and direction with the existence of this enemy. They have to exist so that we can. In today's disjointed world, Islam and terror are becoming uttered together more and more. Marginal groups who until the 1970s had no impact and were not taken seriously have suddenly become players with terror attacks. Is this a response to the homelessness and humiliation that modernity has brought? Or is this an attempt to cure the despair of being who you are by a desire to be like the other? Or is it in fact a process by which the victimized becomes one with his aggressor as defense against his aggression? What is it that causes a religion that most Muslims look onto as a source of peace and welfare suddenly becomes a terror organ that preaches death and destruction in the minds of a group of zealots? There are those who think that the holy warrior's, in quotation, real aim is to avenge the humiliation he has faced. Societal changes that took centuries in Western societies are occurring within the space of 2 generations in Muslim societies, and this is leaving young people devoid of identity and security. The activist wishes to bring a world that has left it homeless, that is broken and wrong, towards the right path. He has concrete truths that are indisputable. By using the group identity as a shield, he shows mercy towards those that are with him and hatred towards those against him. The group identity revives and strengthens his crushed identity for a divine purpose. With this feeling of belonging, he is able to love and value himself. The proponents of this view, or the identity marketers, explain the whole discourse through alienation. The reason for the pain is historical experience, and the blame is elsewhere. The bad people came and misled us, say the holy victims, and the feeling of individual responsibility is replaced by a victim mentality. According to this view, individual and collective pain is a result of the perverse dogmatic beliefs. And the only solution is for the individual's emotional state to be brought back to its previous state of innocence. Of course, there are many other factors which prepare group mentality for violence and terror, but narcissistic anger resulting from the historical defeat and humiliation is an important factor in extreme groups that consider it their duty to improve the world. In other words, for a terrorist, religion and ideology are convenient tools. His aim is not to glorify God's words, but to prove his own strength. He is a deviant who watches the destruction and death he causes with pleasure. In the hands of these people, religion transforms the brutality and bloodshed into something transcendent and holy. Promising young people who have never experienced a noble life, promising young people who have never experienced a noble life are promised a noble death and charmed by the prospect of heaven. The young man who blows up his body by believing this promise and thinking he has gained a passport to heaven thinks that he is avenging a life that he has not been able to live. This might be said as the, this might be described as the, let me skip some of my pages. Ruth Stein quotes William James about the joy which may result from absolute self-surrender. She believes suicide bombers may experience a transcendental mystical experience of a special nature, becoming one with one's victims, marrying them in death and destruction. Stein believes that a system of sanctioned violence can assure the prevention or cure of the ubiquitous human violence that has no beginning and no end. A concentration of legitimized violence is affected by sacrifice. Sorry, there has been some mistakes in intonation. In any way, there is a joy in self-surrender, and there is a transcendental mystical experience of a spatial nature that you fuse with your victims. One of the dynamics, very well-known dynamics of suicide is the desire to fuse, to become one with the lost one. The person wants to go to heaven because he has lost his father, and so he commits suicide to come unity, to come together in the heaven with his father. This is his fantasy, this is his thought. So sometimes suicidal terrorism might have a similar motivation. And there is one interesting thought which I do want to criticize as well. That is some academicians in the United States suggest that modernity necessarily increases the array of choice available to the individuals. So, the terror that appears in the Islamic world is a reaction to modernity and the abundance of choice. According to them, no military action can be successful unless Islam makes peace with modernity. I think this is a heavily criticized view now in sociology and political science, since it carries very culturalist and orientalist tones. This view conceals the very modern and almost reactionary nature of terrorism. Today, we most often see that global terror movement is led by the diaspora and the young people who have been brought up away from their countries and ethnic communities. This type of terror not only disconnects religion from the past, but makes it more personal, more worldly, and more of a political tool. Therefore, it is a modern movement in every sense of the word. In every sense of the word. Iqbal Ahmed, who is a British Pakistani scholar, says that fanatics, these religious fanatics, are obsessed with controlling other people's personal behavior, seeking an Islamic order reduced a penal code, stripped of its humanism, aesthetics, intellectual quests, and spiritual devotion. They try to enforce an absolute assertion of one generally decontextualized aspect of religion and the total disregard of another. This phenomenon distorts religion, debases tradition, and twists the political process wherever it unfolds. I've just seen a documentary by BBC called My Brother the Islamist. Have you seen that? Very interesting one. A TV reporter goes shooting for a documentary to his stepbrother, who has become a convert and has belonged to a radical group operated probably by Pakistanis, I don't know. And I was very surprised that all they wanted is, I mean, they are shouting in the streets. There are 250 people in the UK, but they occupy many of the newspapers, and what they want is they want Sharia in the UK. They want that those who steal should be cut from the arms, that women should wear burqas or completely cover themselves. This is anyone can guess that this is an impossible mission, but they are there and shouting for slogans like that. So it has nothing to do with the spirit of the religion. It has nothing with the intellectual history of the religion. It just wants the strict rules to be applied in the British society. Interestingly, we see that individuals used in these terrorist acts are often from countries with a colonial history. I have to say this. This is not a surprising result, given that contemporary political Islam has also arisen as a reaction to colonialism. Indeed, colonizing powers never tried to encourage or foster growth and development of political institutions in the colonized countries, leaving them deficient in the political infrastructure, which is the sine qua non of democratic societies. In the words of Dick Blackwell, I'm citing him, I'm quoting him, former colonizers lent their weight to those elements who would deal most favorably with them. That is to say, those who would maintain the flow of cheap raw materials, keep the country open to Western investment and its markets open to Western products. They opposed rather vigorously any tendencies towards those countries trying to change or overthrow the established economic setup, such as nationalizing the Suez Canal. So, concludes the writer, what we have is not simply a gap between haves and have-nots, not simply a standoff between modernity and fundamentalism, and not a conflict between civilization and barbarism. The picture we have instead is of a system of political and economical relationships in which the wealth of those that have is a product of the systematic exploitation of those that have not. Modernity is built on the selective promotion of fundamentalism, and civilization is advanced and defended by deploying its split of barbarism against those excluded from its parameters. Although they point to Islam as their motivation, okay, thank you. I'm done. I mean, the last time that I said this was 10 minutes ago, but I'm really done now. So I'm finishing my last paragraph. Although they point to Islam as their motivation, it is obvious that the terrorists' greatest harm is to Islam and to Muslims. In actual fact, this doomsday ideology exactly replicates the hegemonic thought that it opposes. It doesn't respect the past and tradition. It doesn't benefit from civilized thought and wisdom. It recreates a paranoid fantasy based on the idea of us against them. The thought that they are purely evil, we are purely good, and they are attacking our lifestyle is a common slogan for fanatics on both sides of this asymmetrical war. And finally, I would like to finish with a wish. Powerlessness corrupts just like power. Although the extremists carry shame on their faces, they also bring many moderate Muslims who would never go to the extremes to shame. A religion that preaches that the only good witness on the day of judgment will be a good heart is now under the threat of those who willingly stamp on people's hearts. Against the threat of new marginalism, we have to call the heart for help. Like rain in a desert, only it can save us from this draft. Only those with hearts can see the miracles that take place inside them, and only those with hearts can resist evil. Thanks very much for your patience, Meek.
Thank you, Kemal.
Thank you.
We'll go straight to Bülent Diken's final paper, and, well, not his final paper, but the final paper for this afternoon. And the title of Bülent's paper is Lenin's Chirological Fanaticism.
Thank you, Mick. As an effect, fanaticism often takes the form of a nihilist destruction and, of course, self-destruction. Thus, towards the end of The Devils, Dostoevsky's fanatic terrorist, Verkhovensky, modeled on Bakunin's anarchist friend Nechayev, sets the whole town on fire, aiming at the systematic destruction of society. Similarly, in Melville's Moby Dick, Ahab is prepared, for hate's sake, to spit his last breath at Moby Dick. But his fanatic passion for revenge, the hot fire of his purpose, to which he sacrifices all mortal interests, destroys Ahab himself before Moby Dick. What is at issue here is the ambivalence of fire as a social topology. Fire, perhaps the most powerful metaphor for fanaticism, signifies a search for a bond with truth, and this is the fanatic's Promethean aspect as a worshipper of fire. But one can burn with fire as well as leap with it. Thus, fire, initially the symbol of hope, often turns into a symbol of lack of hope, giving rise to a paranoid closure. But fanaticism can also take the form of a revolutionary, creative destruction. Hence, the pharmacon-like gift of Zarathustra, fire, or Marx's insistence on the leap that creates something that has never yet existed. In both cases, when we speak of fanaticism, we are speaking of the inhuman, of an intoxication which is dependent on disappearance, on the disappearance of what exists in a spectacular way, in a nihilistic or revolutionary spectacle of fire. Thus, Nietzsche's Overman wants to perish in order to destroy the nihilistic society around himself. Marx's proletariat, likewise, wants to abolish the surrounding society in order to abolish itself. So, in a way, if you say fanaticism is bad, you are right. If you say fanaticism is good, you are also right. If you say this is contradictory, you are also right. For fanaticism is an empty sign that is meaningful only when it is thought together, brought together with other signs, only when it is transfigured. Or to re-paraphrase Baudrillard, fanaticism is like an astrological sign that is meaningful only when accompanied by its ascendant. The sign itself is nothing. Accompanied, it becomes inescapable. In other words, only by redoubling itself, fanaticism can make itself an event. In this sense, the problem with fanatic conviction is perhaps not the fanaticness of conviction as such, but the transformations, metamorphosis the fanatic can or cannot go through. Following this, one way of grasping the sense of fanaticism as a concept might be to focus on its sterility or neutrality with respect to its actual forms. To say that the sense of fanaticism is neutral or sterile is to say that it is indifferent to affirmation or negation, that it is not affected by any proposition which refers to actual historical qualities, quantities, or relations. By the same token, what makes the concept of fanaticism interesting is not only its actualized forms or structures, but also the potentialities it expresses. Not only its meaning produced at the level of commonsensical, scientific, or ideological representation, but also its sense produced at the level of singularities. Only on this basis it can be possible to hold a common concept of fanaticism, while everybody can agree to disagree about its different conceptions. Only on this basis it is possible to have a common idea of fanaticism, which can be dramatized differently by different actors. Which is why the dramatization or the repetition of a fanatic idea can be revolutionary or end up as what Deleuze has called transcendental stupidity. That is, as an unsuccessful attempt at actualization, which brings an idea to life without giving it a form. In the following, I would like to focus on a revolutionary fanatic, Lenin. Here is how a conservative historian, Max Nomad, repeats the standard appraisal of Lenin in his book, Apostles of Revolution. I quote, Lenin's wavering between the adventurist utopianism and his own realism was not accidental. It was one of the manifestations of his split personality, as it were. He was a man who, on the one hand, was a visionary and a narrow fanatic, and on the other, had his feet firmly planted on the ground. It was this combination of contradictory qualities which helped him win the hypnotized devotion of both idealists and rogues. The former saw in him the Messiah who would lead them to the promised land of democracy and socialism. Those were the pure in heart, but there were also the not so pure in heart who saw in Lenin a political gang leader of genius. Lenin as the name of the oscillation between two extremes, between utopian intoxication and strategic instrumental rationality. But does politics need to choose between these two poles? What if this is a false antagonism, thereby a false choice, and therefore a trap for true politics? What if, in other words, the relationship between utopianism and strategic calculation does not necessarily point toward a split and antinomy, but rather to an aporia intrinsic to the temporality of the event, kairos? After all, kairos, the temporality of the event, signifies a double necessity: seizing the moment and being seized by the moment at once. Two dimensions which must be held together in the form of a disjunctive synthesis without letting the one collapse into the other. Thus, on the one hand, one must transcend what Lenin called the vicious circle of politics as usual. Confronted with an endless bare repetition in which nothing new happens, one must take the risk of a leap, that is, decide and act. This leap is at once incommensurable with the existing situation and immanent to it. In this sense, the Leninist temporal strategy is based on the readiness to seize the moment, a state of being available to act in relation to whatever event may arise. This dimension of kairos, readiness to decide, however, is accompanied in Lenin by an absolute decidedness. Consider the April thesis, which did not exactly make him popular. I quote from another conservative historian, Adam Yulam, who describes the moment Lenin presented his April thesis in a meeting in this way. To the majority of those present at the meeting, this was a thunderbolt, a repudiation not only of the previous Bolshevik position, but it appeared of Marxism itself. Everybody knew that this was not the moment for a socialist revolution, but for a bourgeois democratic one. Lenin's theses were a declaration of anarchism, of adventurism unworthy of a Marxist. But this is nonsense, shouted one Menshevik. Insane nonsense. To others, it appeared that surely Lenin was out of touch with real conditions in Russia. Lenin is always thinking politically, and this is what strikes his commentators as obsessional and repulsive, as inhuman. What makes Lenin's political thinking inhuman is, of course, his absolute receptivity, his enthusiasm for the revolution, his willingness to be formed by the moment, his intoxication, which seizes him as much as his will to seize the moment. And if such a chirological double act seems insane nonsense, it is because it neither seeks any guarantee regarding its actual consequences, nor try to hide behind references to objective facts. Any radical politics, asserts Walter Benjamin, must win the energies of intoxication for the revolution. And regarding intoxication, he refers to force of hate in Marx, to Nechayev, and to Dostoevsky's novel, The Devils. What fascinates Benjamin in Nechayev, for instance, is precisely the element of intoxication. After all, Nechayev's Catechism of the Revolutionary defines the revolutionary as a possessed person with no personal interest, no property, no name. Everything in him is wholly absorbed in the single thought and the single passion for revolution. The revolutionary is the enemy of every bond the social order represents, the laws, morality, traditions, and conventions which he only sees as semblances. He continues to live with them only in order to destroy them. He knows only one science, the science of destruction, and he despises public opinion. His logic needs no dialogue. The single invariant in Nechayev's thought, the injunction for being a revolutionary, is a self-referential and self-sufficient maxim. It needs no external justification, no objective, no teleological aim or ethical practical condition can delimit the reach of this logic, according to which whatever serves the revolution is ethical. In short, Nechayev's revolutionary, negating all possible relation to the actual society and doing so without any compromise, aims at putting an absolute distance to the state. Needless to say, Nechayev as a figure of the revolutionary borders on Benjamin's destructive character, a radical nihilist who has no vision but is obsessed with one activity, clearing away. But we must also note, contra the mainstream political philosophy, which only finds a senseless violence in Nechayev, that it is not violence in itself that is the problem here. After all, extreme enthusiasm or fanatic intoxication and violence often go hand in hand in politics, for what is at stake in radical politics is ultimately the transvaluation of all values. The Leninist passion for the real, for instance, knows of no morality. Indeed, both Lenin and Nechayev juxtapose the real and its semblances. For both, the revolutionary activity is necessarily an activity of purification, of extracting the real from reality, making the real coincide with its semblance. The real as pure event of its transparency. The danger here is, of course, radical nihilism or terrorism, because the real as a total absence of reality is simply nothingness. This is why Benjamin insists regarding the revolutionary intoxication that the actual must not be destroyed. And herein we arrive at the aporia of Kairos. Violence is necessary, but as Michael Dillon observed, there is no calculus as to how much violence is revolutionary violence. Without a calculus, the risk is to fall into the trap of radical nihilism, while the danger with a calculus is passive nihilism. In other words, both sides of kairos, strategy and intoxication, calculus and conviction, knowledge and fidelity are necessary. Strategy without intoxication, that is passive nihilism, is as useless as intoxication without strategy, that is radical nihilism. This brings us to a fundamental problem with the conservative theory of revolution, thereby the conservative view of fanaticism. It can think of this aporia only in terms of an antinomy. Max Weber, for instance, approaches the split between strategy and intoxication as an antinomy, as a contradiction between what he calls the ethic of conviction and the ethic of responsibility. Thus, he claims, confronted with the inherent ethical irrationality of the world, all political action has to make a choice between two opposed maxims. It can either, he says, justify itself with reference to an ethic of ultimate ends, to an absolute ethic that does not ask questions regarding consequences. In his example, the dogmatic Christian acts rightly and leaves the results with the Lord. Or, assuming the burden of decision-making, follows the maxim of an ethic of responsibility, in which case one has to give an account of foreseeable results of one's actions. This is, as Weber formulates it, also a choice between saying, my kingdom is not of this world, and adaptation to the sociological reality of modernity, in which case all talk of revolution is farce. Every thought of abolishing the domination of man by any kind of socialist social system or the most elaborated form of democracy, utopia. Weber's choice is thus ultimately between two renunciations, between renouncing the existing world in the name of an idea or renouncing an idea in the name of the existing world, between values without facts or facts without values, or to use Nietzsche's terminology, between radical nihilism and passive nihilism. Indeed, it seems that whenever the gap between strategy and intoxication is seen as an antinomy rather than aporia, this choice appears as a conservative blackmail. But both sides of kairos are vital. What matters is to keep them in relation. And since this relation cannot be a dialectical relation, since a synthesis is not possible or will result in antinomy, the relationship must be thought of as a disjunctive synthesis, as a parallax of strategy and intoxication, of the economy and pure politics. However, this aporia, the inherent undecidability and uncertainty at the heart of society, does not mean that what emancipatory politics promises is merely an impossible promise, an unattainable dream, which therefore can be infinitely deferred. As Derrida would say, even though the promise of freedom and justice structurally remains impossible, the decision to actualize the promise cannot be deferred. It's absolutely necessary to take a position in actual politics. The idea must be actualized. It is in this sense that, as a contemporary Menshevik, Deleuze insisted Lenin had ideas. The aporia must be overcome in praxis, in the repetition or actualization of the idea. And what provides the space for repetition are false antagonisms. Thus, in Nietzsche, the false choice between radical and passive nihilism exists so that the perfect nihilist or anti-nihilist can overcome himself. In Marx, history repeats itself as farce. History as farce is there so that one can cheerfully destroy it. This is why radical politics always starts with questioning the consensus in a given social space. Free thinking always involves going beyond given questions, and this always necessarily involves intoxication, fanatic libidinal involvement. Thanks.
Ten, 15 minutes for questions and answers. I've reserved a slot for myself, but I don't think that I'm going to do the paper that I might have done, and I was prepared for this moment. But I do also have some, a whole series of points that I would like to underline and bring into play at some point. But for the moment, I just invite questions and responses from the audience. Abir.
Thank you very much for two very interesting papers. I have a comment to expand on what Kemal said about the fanatic thinking that they are supreme believers. Some sources indicate that Osama bin Laden, for example, did not perform the 5 prayers a day because he perceived himself as the supreme Muslim and did not need to do that to attest to his religiosity, and that in the actions that he committed, he was a true Muslim. And so that kind of falls into the theory, into the theoretical work that you presented. But I'm also curious whether in psychoanalytical studies, is there a way to read fanaticism and the fanatic outside of trauma theory? Because, for example, a lot of the profiles of fanatics that we come across do not fit any of this. And you said that this is, you know, some of the things that you highlight do not necessarily mean it involves all fanatics. But if you look at very contemporary fanatical figures, they do not fit any of the profiles that have been circulated for a while. And so where do you envision psychoanalytical theory in relation to this moving towards?
Yes. Thank you. Indeed, psychoanalysis brings some explanations to social movements, to some fanatical stances throughout the history, but these need not have to be true. I mean, these are just explanations. We take it or not. I mean, our logics fit with it or not. Sometimes they bring explanations that most of us would favor, and sometimes it seems quite illogical to us. For example, a psychoanalyst in UK might write that we are sending missiles in the Gulf War because of our phallic desire to have the body of the Arab land as a lady. Okay, it's a phallic symbolism for the missile is the phallic symbolism. This is illogical to me. I mean, this is war. People are dying. You cannot fantasize with war. So, but sometimes, for example, somebody say that psychoanalytically, the German society longed for a very strong father in the time of Hitler, and Hitler was a substitute father for the society, for the German society. This fits with my mind. I mean, I can understand this. So these are all speculations. And some of them are quite concordant with reality, and some of them are quite exaggerations. So I think most of the terrorists and most of the suicide bombers are intact psychologically. They have defense